Welcome to Crosswords, the podcast about practical Christianity. What does it look like to walk in Jesus' footsteps? How do I live in a culture hostile to godliness? These are questions that we'll answer on each podcast as we get our heart and mind on Jesus. All scriptures quoted are from the New International Version. You can follow me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing. We've already talked about what happens when we die, and before that we touched a little bit on what is Hades, what is Tartarus, and the temporariness of that place. But today we're going to really get to the nitty-gritty of what Jesus taught about hell. And there's a very interesting word that comes up in the Greek when we examine what Jesus said in the 5 Gospels concerning that place of eternal torment. And that is the Greek word Gehenna. So hell, or Gehenna, as described in the book of Revelation and in the 5 Gospels, is the manifestation that our sin against an infinitely holy God warrants eternal punishment. Moreover, if we try to minimize the reality of hell, we're actually maligning the mercy of God. Because central to the fact of hell is that it is inescapable. And that's what Jesus emphasized in his teachings. However, Jesus endured the wrath of God on our behalf so that if we trust in him, we will be delivered from the wrath of God and brought into fellowship with him forever. So hell is part and parcel of the gospel message. We cannot understand the love of God, as Charlie was teaching us last week, unless we first try to wrap our heads around what eternal torment or punishment is. And I'm not saying that we're going to be able to wrap our heads around that, but know that it is there and that it exists and that it is real and that it is eternal, but that it also is escapable. You don't have to end there. That's the good news. Amen? So what is Gehenna? Well, Gehenna is a valley. It's actually a place. We're going to look at it in a map. It's the valley of Hinnom, mentioned in Jeremiah 7:31, also in 19, verse 2 through 6. And it was initially a place where the evil kings of Judah sacrificed their children by fire to detestable idols. Therefore, as we read in Jeremiah, that place was deemed cursed. God was very angry about the things that took place there. And so throughout the history and by the times of Jesus, this valley, which was cursed at that time in Jeremiah, became kind of like a very desolate wasteland. It became the city dump. It became the place where you throw out all the refuse, whether organic or inorganic. And so there was a constant smoldering fire there, burning up the garbage. And because there was a lot of organic stuff thrown there, dead bodies, dead carcasses, there was also worms constantly there at the end of that pile or in that pile somewhere. And it's Jesus who takes this picture, this word picture of Gehenna and what the Jews knew about it, and compared that place to the lake of fire, the second death spoken of in Revelation 20:10, and so on and so forth. Where was this valley in relation to Jerusalem? Well, as you can see in that red circle, it was toward the south of the city, and it was a kind of like a small part. There were many valleys that surrounded Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem was built on a hill. And so towards the south was this valley called the Valley of Hinnom. So it was right outside Jerusalem, the city dump, where dead bodies and trash constantly burned, constantly smoldered in these fires. And so Gehenna eventually became the substitute or became known as hell. But that's not the only comparison. We're going to look at 7 things that Jesus had to say about this place of eternal torment, this lake of fire. 7 different ways that he described this place so that we could remember how devastating it is. And gee, we better keep ourselves out of there and everyone else that we know. So to clarify, when Jesus is speaking of this Gehenna, he is not talking about Hades. That's something that we need to understand. As you will see, everything that he says about Gehenna is eternal. It's never ending. Whereas when we looked at Luke 16, verse 19 through 31 some time ago, we saw that it's a place that will cease to exist. It's a temporary holding place, so to speak. But the lake of fire itself is not. As you can see, eventually there will be a judgment day. This was a graph I showed last time of what happens when we die. And after that judgment day, we're told that everything in this physical world, and even some things in the nether world like Hades and death, will be thrown into the lake of fire, the book of Revelation says, so that the forever that exists is the New Jerusalem, and this lake of fire is eternal. It's an eternal place of torment. So let's see what Jesus has to say about this place. In Matthew 5:22, he says, I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, raka, which is a term of contempt, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of hell. Now, whenever hell is there in the Greek, it says Gehenna. I am putting it up there so that you understand how it would read in the Greek. Because sometimes the New Testament writers use that word hell, but it's really not hell, it's Hades. And sometimes it's Gehenna. 2 different places, 2 different realities. So we have to understand. And that's why I put it in the Greek so that you know what he's talking about here. Notice how hell here, or Gehenna, is shown to be a place of judgment. Because first he speaks about the court. He speaks about being subject to judgment. And then he introduces Gehenna, or the fires of Gehenna, as the ultimate judgment. One that is, you can't escape. So he's trying to set the stage here for us. This was very, very early on in his ministry when he says this. Then in the same chapter, a few verses later, 29 through 30, he'll say, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into Gehenna. Wow, this is pretty graphic. Jesus says, nobody here wants to lose a part of their body. We're pretty attached to them. We don't want to lose them. But he says, if it's about going to Gehenna, I'd rather lose a part of the body. That's how we need to think about this eternal place of judgment. I'd rather lose as many parts as need to be lost than to end up with my whole body there. This is how Jesus is presenting this Gehenna to us. He talks about Gehenna at the place of destruction. That's one way he explains it. It kind of reminds me of a few movies that came out a long time ago. I don't recommend for you to see them. I don't know what they're rated, but I remember Escape from New York. Okay, Escape from LA. Gosh, man, you guys are all brand new. You don't know what I'm talking about. That's good. That's better. But anyway, these movies presented Manhattan, the whole island of Manhattan, as a place of destruction, like you're seeing right here. They say that New York got to be so bad that they had to turn all of Manhattan into a prison. They kind of just left it there and walled it off. And good luck to you if you're in Manhattan trying to get out. So it was a very dystopian version of the future of Manhattan. But the images from that movie get you to see, wow, this is what a place of destruction is all about, where chaos rules, where everything is going downhill. And that's how Jesus described it in Matthew 7:13. He tells us, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. That's the Greek word apoleia, which means to destroy, to abolish, to waste. It means ruin or complete loss, completely useless. Kind of like what Manhattan became after they left it there for all the unruly and disobedient people to rule. This is the same word, apoleia, used in other familiar passages that speak of Gehenna. Notice in Romans 9:22 where Paul says, what if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction. So this alludes to a place that has been prepared for destruction. This place that Jesus calls Gehenna, which is that place is going to receive the entire wrath of God. Think about that. All of the wrath of God is going to be poured there. The author of Hebrews says, but we don't belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, rendered completely useless. But no, we are those who have faith and are saved. So here we're presented an alternative. We don't have to end up in the place destined for destruction. If we claim our right to be children of God, that's why we do it, to avoid that. Peter says, by the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. So again, talking about that place that's going to be there, that all these objects of wrath are going to end up with after judgment. And everything is going to be reserved for fire. So images of fire, images of destruction. Those are things that we're seeing related to Gehenna. Jesus will also say here in Matthew 10:28, don't be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy, that's that Greek word again, both soul and body in Gehenna. Yet another thing for us to consider. Many of us are afraid of people who could hurt us, and rightly so. Afraid of somebody that might shoot you or kill you or maim you in some sort of way. But notice how graphic. Jesus is taking that visualization and saying, you know what? Don't be afraid of those people. Because all they can do is hurt this. And that's not who you really are. Be afraid, rather, of the one who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna. He will say in Luke 12, verse 4 and 5, my friends, something similar, a similar passage, but said a little differently. Don't be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more, because they don't have authority to deal with the hereafter. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after your body has been killed, has authority. Here he presents it as something having to do with authority. He has the authority to throw you into Gehenna. Yes, I tell you, fear him. So just to clarify with this description of it being a place of destruction, some people think that destruction is an act of annihilation. And I'm here to tell you that the two are very different. When you annihilate something, that word to annihilate means the end of the existence of something. Something that's it's physically impossible to happen in this world. For one of the laws of science is matter cannot be created or destroyed. You think if you blow something up, you're destroying it, or you're annihilating it? No, you're destroying it, yes. But you're not annihilating it, it's still somewhere. It didn't cease to exist. And apparently the same is true in the hereafter. God does not annihilate anything. He destroys, though. And that's why he can say that the destruction is eternal. Because if he annihilated that, then it wouldn't make sense for it to be eternal, because it's over. It's done. It's gone. But that's not what it is. We're going to see in the verses following that this lake of fire continues to exist alongside but apart from God and heaven. If annihilation was the idea conveyed in the scriptures, then hell would not be qualified with words such as eternal, everlasting, forever. This is how Jesus speaks of this eternal lake of fire when he uses Gehenna to describe the eternal place of torment. So he's talked about it as being a place of destruction. Now he is going to talk about it being a fiery furnace or a blazing furnace. This is another word picture he uses when speaking of Gehenna. And he does so here in Matthew 13, 38 through 40. He says, this is in speaking, of course, of the parable of the sower. Towards the end of the parable, he's explaining, a different parable, sorry. He says, the field is the world, the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom, the weeds are the people of the evil one, the enemy who sows them is the devil, the harvest is at the end of the age, and the harvesters are the angels. It's a little cliff notes of the previous parable he spoke of. In verse 40, he says, as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So here we see a description of it being a blazing furnace, something akin to what a farmer would do after he collected all the weeds and he'd throw them in the fire. It's to be destroyed, to get rid of it. And so at the end of the age, Jesus says, God is going to do the same thing with the people whom he calls weeds, those who have followed the devil and his ways. But notice that he also uses another phrase here, an interesting phrase that pops up in almost every other place he talks about Gehenna, along with some other descriptions. This one seems kind of consistent, and that is the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I can't help but I tried to look for an image, in a reasonable image, one that wouldn't be too controversial. And that was hard to do, because if you see what the images are like when you search on Google or on Bing for weeping and gnashing of teeth, it hits you. This is a place, the very words, where weeping is eternal. It's unstoppable. It's unconsolable. And not just weeping, meaning either sadness or pain. I would tend to think more of pain and maybe regret, because it's also accompanied with this phrase, gnashing of teeth. Something that I have yet to experience. When I had the shingles, I had a lot of pain, but I was not gnashing my teeth. I know some women out there, when they're in labor and they don't have an epidural, may gnash their teeth. Is that true or no? I don't know. I didn't see any hands raised up. Maybe you all got epidurals, okay. But that means something so painful that doubles you up and makes you gnash your teeth, writhing in pain. That image alone sets the tone. Wow, I don't even want to ever know what a place like that is. And I don't want anybody else to know either. Well, that's what Jesus' thoughts were. He didn't want anybody to end up there. Here in the parable of the net, in Matthew 13, 49 through 50, he'll say this is how it will be at the end of the age. Notice how almost all of these descriptions of Gehenna that he's giving us here occur at the end of the age, meaning after judgment, which is consistent with the images we've seen before about the difference between Hades and the lake of fire. The lake of fire is after judgment. And that's what Jesus is speaking of here. He says this is how it's going to be. The angels will come, separate the wicked from the righteous, and throw them in the blazing furnace. Again, a reference to the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
If you like this podcast, please show your support by clicking on the support link on my Anchor FM profile. You will find the link listed in the description of the podcast on your favorite podcast app. With your support, I will continue to produce authentic Christian content as the Lord allows me to do.
Another description. Can you see that? No, maybe you're not supposed to. The outer darkness. Interesting. Here in the parable of the talents, in Matthew 25, 29 through 30, Jesus says, "For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever doesn't have, even what they have, will be taken away from them. And throw that worthless servant," that was the servant who got a talent and he dug it in the ground. That's the guy. He said, "Throw them into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." We also see here Matthew 25:30 in the ESV, a little different. "Cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Something scary about the outer darkness. It's a dark place. It's like a blazing furnace. There's destruction. There's weeping. There's gnashing of teeth. You're getting a picture here from all these different things that he's saying? Not a good one. He also talks about it being an everlasting fire. Here, where he talks about the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25:41, he'll say, "Then he will say to those on his left," those are the goats, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." And something interesting to note here, that Gehenna was originally there not for humans, but for the devil and his angels. It's just that if we get suckered by the devil and his angels, well, we're going to end up in the same place they'll end up. A few verses down, verse 46, he says, "Then they will go away to eternal punishment," referring to the goats, but referring to the sheep, "to the righteous, but the righteous to eternal life." Another description Jesus uses is where the worm never dies. Now, to some of you, worms are gross. They could be quite gross. And again, I tried to search for an image that wouldn't gross you out. This is just earthworms in the dirt. It's pretty clean. And this is something somebody is happy to see, like me, who wants my grass to be green in the spring. I want to see earthworms in the dirt. That means I got healthy dirt. But that's not what Jesus was talking about when he talks about where the worm never dies. Think about dead bodies decomposing. Or have you ever had the chance to look at something in your refrigerator that was decomposing and had maggots or worms in it? Maggots or worms. Those are the worms he's talking about, not earthworms. He's talking about maggots. He's talking about the worms that eat dead carcasses. And that's what he says here in Mark 9, 47 and 48. He says, we kind of read a similar passage in Matthew, but this one here in Mark says, "If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than for you to have two eyes and be thrown into Gehenna, which is hell fire, where the worms that eat them," meaning where the worms that eat your eyes and your body, do not die, and the fire is not quenched. Speaking to the fact that this is a permanent place. Just like in Gehenna, where the worms never seemed to die. There were always plenty of worms there because there were plenty of carcasses that were feeding them. This word picture of where the worm does not die is actually borrowed from Isaiah 66:24, where it speaks of the desolation that was to come. And the prophet, or God speaking to the prophet, says, they will go out and look on the dead bodies of those who rebelled against me. The worms that eat them will not die. The fire that burns them will not be quenched. And they will be loathsome to all mankind. So you see, all the way from the prophets, this valley of Hinnom and all the descriptions concerning it was an abominable place because children were sacrificed to idols. And then it became that cursed ground that in Jesus' time was the city dump, where the fires never ended and the worms never died. But we're not done yet. There's one more description Jesus has for us, and that is the place of the hypocrites. Being a hypocrite is so loathsome to God that he uses hypocrites to describe Gehenna as well. He does so in Matthew 24:50 and 51. This is the parable of the faithful and the wise servant versus the wicked servant. He says, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour that he's not aware of. He will cut him, speaking of the wicked servant, he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And again, you see that phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, accompanying almost all the descriptions that we've seen so far. So here we see 7 descriptions that were given. 7 ways Jesus chose to depict Gehenna, just so that we could have an understanding and appreciate what God is saving us from. Because he doesn't want us to get to know that place, because if you do, it's forever. It's not like, okay, I'm going to be there, I'm going to get to know what it is, then I can get out. No, the time to get out of there and to make sure you don't end up there is now. As he says in Matthew 7, pick the narrow road, enter through the narrow gate, because the wide gate is the one that is going to end up in destruction. God willing, in our next series, or next lesson on Gehenna, we're going to be speaking about what terrified Jesus the most in his experience here on earth. Where do you go when you die? Where will you end up? Well, the way that it is set up for now is for us to have an understanding that while we're in this flesh, this is our time of testing. This is the time that God is giving us to decide and to make sure that we pick the right path, pick the right gate, so that we're sure to end up with God. Some people say you can't be sure. But when I read the New Testament, Jesus teaches us and assures us that if we stick with him, and if we choose him, and if we follow in his footsteps, he guarantees us. And the fact that he gives us the Holy Spirit, he says, I give him to you as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. So it is not something we have to fear. We don't have to fear ending up in hell unless you're a hypocrite, unless you're wishy-washy, unless you've got one foot in the world and one foot in the kingdom, which is what a hypocrite is about. But if that's not your case, or even if that is your case right now, you still have hope. You have a chance to decide and say, you know what? I really want to be convicted. Help me in my unbelief as that guy said to Jesus. That should be our attitude if we're like, man, I really don't want to end up there. Because Jesus has a lot to say about this place. Absolutely. And he wants us to make sure that we're using our experiences here on this earth to end up being with him forever. Not letting the experiences we have here on earth drag us into depression or into fear, bitterness, and anger. Things that the forces of evil know will drag you down to be in eternal torment where they will be. Two clear choices. A lot of warnings about hell, a lot of encouragement about heaven. And that's why Jesus came to deliver us this news. He didn't want us to end up there. He didn't make Gehenna, or the lake of fire, a place for human beings. Quite the opposite, for the devil and his angels. But it just so happens that right now, we're living in a period of time, this time in the flesh. This is the time of testing, where God tests us to see if we're going to end up trusting him, believing him. As Jesus says, those who believe in me shall not perish, but will have eternal life. John 3:16. And that's why we want to look to the gospel and understand, wow, Jesus provided that atonement for me so that my sin doesn't have to lead me to the same place where the devil and his angels are going to end up. No, I can claim that innocence. Even though I'm not innocent, I can claim Jesus' innocence. He allows me to. He gave me that right to become a child of his by that sacrifice that he made on the cross. And so the way now to take that, to accept that, and to change your eternal destiny is by joining Jesus in baptism. If the gospel, if that good news is something that you believe and something you know to be true, then immediately the next step is to say, I want to claim this right Jesus is extending to me. I want to be a child of God and be sure to escape that eternal destruction that will await those who don't believe God, who've rejected God, who don't accept the gospel. But instead, right now, we can opt to begin newness of life in Jesus Christ. So I pray this lesson has helped you and encouraged you and helped you appreciate all the more the mercy that God extends to us. There's no way that we as human beings will wrap our heads around such a place as Gehenna or even heaven. But the fact that Jesus said these things and showed us how serious it is by coming here and giving his life up just so that we could have a chance at believing that and coming close to God. Those are things that should make you think and say, wow, you know what? I really want to make a choice and start living that life now, because it's going to be the best choice anyway for now and forever. So I pray if that's something that you're thinking about, if you haven't done it yet but you want to do it, or maybe you want to find more about it, please come forward, join these men in prayer as the rest of us stand and sing the song of invitation. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope the Lord gave you insight into conforming to Jesus with today's message. I always appreciate feedback. You can send me your thoughts, musings, and comments directly through the Anchor app. You can also contact me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing.